Through the intercession of St. Blaise, Bishop and Martyr, may God set you free from illness of the throat and every other evil. Every February 3rd, the feast day of St. Blaise, there's a pious Catholic tradition where the faithful can receive this blessing of the throat. But who is this bishop and martyr, and why do we bless throats on his feast day? In this episode, number 4 in my series on martyrs, I'll answer these questions as we trek through the history of St. Blaise.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio opis gaudium magnum. Habemus papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
The first reference we have of St. Blaise seems to come from the writings of Aetius of Amida in the 6th century, which was about 300 years after the life of St. Blaise. Aetius was the chief doctor or personal physician of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. We know of Aetius primarily because of the medical books he wrote. In one such work, he mentioned how St. Blaise was invoked for illnesses related to the throat. The Acts of St. Blaise, which details his life and martyrdom, were not written until 4 centuries after his death, which has led some to doubt their contents and consider the accounts legendary. There seems to be a fair deal of certainty that St. Blaise existed. It's only a matter of the details of his life and martyrdom that tend to be questioned. The doctor of the church, St. Alphonsus de Liguori, considered them to be reliable, using the Acts as a source for a chapter on St. Blaise in his 1776 work, Victories of the Martyrs. In this work, St. Alphonsus referenced the scrupulous work of the Bollandists and the different manuscripts of the Acts of St. Blaise. So, for our purposes, I'll rely on this doctor of the church and the Bollandists and assume the information we have on the life and death of St. Blaise is fairly accurate, at least in the basics. St. Blaise was a native of the city of Sebaste in Armenia, which may sound familiar from episode 139, the 40 Martyrs of Sebaste, who were a group of 40 Roman legionaries frozen to death on an icy lake for refusing to renounce their Catholic faith. Blaise studied philosophy and then became a physician. He lived a holy life of extraordinary virtues and great learning and exhibited much charity towards the poor. And around the year 300, upon the death of Sebaste's bishop, Blaise was elected by the people to become the bishop's successor. As mentioned in episode 139, Licinius was the brother-in-law and former ally of the Emperor Constantine, and ruled the eastern half of the former Roman Empire. Like Constantine, he allowed for toleration of the Christians, but in the early 4th century, Licinius resumed the persecutions against Christians in the eastern half of the empire. Agricolas, the governor of Cappadocia and Minor Armenia, enforced the emperor's edict for Christians to either apostatize or be put to death. It was this persecution which led to the death of those 40 martyrs of Sebaste. And it was also on account of this persecution that the newly elected Bishop Blaise took up an eremitical life in a cave on Mount Argius, outside of Sebaste, where he devoted himself to prayer. There are different accounts of his time living in this cave. In one, he was visited by numerous crowds of the faithful, who came to seek and receive cures for both bodily and spiritual maladies. My personal take is, while he may have been visited by some of his flock, if he was truly being visited by large crowds, then the cave would have been a lousy hiding place, and Agricolas should have been able to find the bishop rather quickly upon enforcing the persecutions. Another account claims the only visitors to Blaise's cave were ferocious wild beasts, and this is perhaps more likely as each of the various manuscripts in the Acts of St. Blaise agrees that he was visited by wild animals who would come to the cave, patiently wait for him to conclude his prayers, receive a blessing, and then go on their way. One manuscript compares St. Blaise to Daniel in the lion's den and Elias in the wilderness. In another version, tells of ravens supplying him with food, and explains how men and beasts lived in harmony before the original sin, and the close relationship between Blaise and these animals showed the purity of the saint. the governor Agricolas ordered that the Christians should be put to death by being devoured by wild beasts. And so he sent hunters into the wilderness surrounding Sebaste to collect animals suitable for this method of execution. These hunters stumbled upon St. Blaise, peacefully surrounded by ferocious animals. Initially astonished and perhaps even frightened by the sight, they reported this oddity to Agricolas, who then sent soldiers to have the bishop arrested. Apparently, Blaise cheerfully said, "Let us go shed our blood for Jesus Christ." It was after this arrest that the famous healing attributed to St. Blaise occurred, although there are some conflicting details. In one account, the streets filled with sad citizens who came to ask for a blessing as he was being hauled to jail. One woman, whose son was dying because of a small bone stuck in his throat, begged for his intercession. St. Blaise then prayed to the Lord for the recovery of both the boy and any others who may be similarly afflicted. And then the boy miraculously recovered. In another version, when Blaise was being taken to prison, a woman came to him, seeking his intercession on account of a wolf which had carried off her pig. Blaise offered a prayer, and the wolf returned the pig to the woman. In thanks, she brought him some candles to his prison cell so he would have light to read the scriptures. And it was while imprisoned that this other woman came seeking his intercession for her son who was dying from the bone lodged in his throat. And so Blaise then held these candles over the boy's throat while praying for his recovery, similar to the traditional throat blessing we have today. Blaise was presented to the governor Agricolas, who commanded him to offer sacrifice to the pagan gods. Blaise refused and possibly said, "What a title for your demons, who can bring only evil on their worshippers. There is only one immortal God, and him do I adore." Agricolas then ordered that the saint undergo a severe beating and scourging, and then sent him back to prison. It's said that while in prison, he worked many extraordinary miracles, and so it's likely at this point in the story when the woman visited him, asking for the healing of her son with the bone stuck in his throat. These miracles prompted Agricolas to order Blaise to be hung from a tree while his flesh was torn with iron hooks and combs. After being beaten and ripped with iron hooks, the governor had him beheaded. Although one version of the story, which is possibly spurious, gives a much more fantastic series of events after he was torn with the iron hooks and before his beheading. In this version, while his body was being lacerated by the iron tools, several pious women collected the saint's blood, which profusely poured from his body. These women were then seized with 2 of their children and brought before Agricolas, who ordered them to sacrifice to the pagan gods. In response, they asked for idols. But when the pagan idols were brought to them, these women defiantly cast the idols into the lake, upon which Agricolas had them beheaded along with their children. Infuriated by the Christian defiance, Agricolas then intensified the torture imposed upon Blaise. He had Blaise stretched upon a rack, his flesh torn again with iron combs, a red-hot coat of mail placed upon his body, and had him cast into a lake. But when he was thrown into the lake, Blaise armed himself with the sign of the cross and miraculously walked upon the waters. He then walked to the middle of the lake and invited his pagan persecutors to pray to their gods to allow them to do the same. And a few did attempt this, but were immediately drowned. Blaise was then admonished by a voice from heaven to leave the lake and undergo his martyrdom. So he walked to the shore, where he was finally beheaded. Even if the details are a bit misaligned, the accounts all seem to agree he healed a boy with a bone stuck in his throat, he was tortured, and then he was beheaded. Veneration of St. Blaise spread, and as previously mentioned, he came to be invoked against ailments of the throat. During the Black Death, Blaise became one of the 14 Holy Helpers, who were a group of saints invoked for protection against diseases and other bodily disorders. In addition to St. Blaise, the 14 Holy Helpers include Saints Acadius, Barbara, Catherine of Alexandria, Christopher, Cyriacus, Dennis, Eustace, Erasmus, or Elmo, George, Giles, Margaret, Pantaleon, and Vitus. Today, the popular blessing of throats is typically given with a pair of consecrated candles, held crossing each other and placed either on the throat or over the head. And while Catholic History Trek does not have any pious traditions involving candles, we do have an episode on them. But one tradition we do have is asking our listeners to subscribe to our podcast, leave a rating, and share it with others. And as Kevin and I typically do, I will end the episode with a prayer in the Church's traditional language of Latin. And instead of the usual minor doxology, or Glory Be, I'll end with the blessing given on the feast of St. Blaise. Per intercessionem Sancti Blasi, Episcopi et Martyrs, libera te Deus a malo guteris, et a quovis alio malo. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.